Hello, my name is Nigel Purvis, and I'm the founder and CEO of Climate Advisors. Climate Advisors is delighted to be hosting this event today with our partners at the Climate Leadership Council, CLC. We are both members of something called the Consortium for Climate Aligned Trade, and you'll be hearing more about that during this program. We have an exciting lineup today to discuss our topic of trade, climate, and the G7. We will be joined by Senator Bill Cassidy and also by Director General Kurt Vandenberghe from the European Commission, as well as a panel of experts from the Consortium for Climate Aligned Trade, who will be sharing the latest research and policy recommendations that they have made. Before introducing Senator Cassidy, I'll just provide a few contextual comments about the issues that we're going to be discussing today. There is a growing need to align climate and trade policy. There are four reasons why this is essential. The first is the environment. The second is the economy. The third is national security. And the fourth is energy security. I'll just go through each of those four topics briefly to explain the connection they have to the climate and trade agendas. From an environmental perspective, decarbonizing goods that are in international trade is absolutely essential. 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions are embodied in goods that are traded across borders. And so achieving global goals or science-based goals for protecting the climate will require making the total carbon and other greenhouse gases that are produced and associated with the shipment and storage of those goods far lower than they are today. So we really need to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of goods that are traded internationally. Of course, doing that will require adopting policies, and those policies have the potential to raise costs for goods, particularly in energy-intensive sectors, the industrial sectors, such as steel and aluminum and cement and fertilizer, where their goods are traded across borders and where the goods are commodities that can be made in a variety of different countries. There's the potential for goods that are made in a country with strong climate standards to be more expensive than the similar goods that are being made in countries that are doing less to tackle the climate problem. And that creates the risk that manufacturing and production will move offshore, thereby reducing the environmental effectiveness of climate policy. Offshoring of production also has the potential to harm the economy, of course. When that occurs, there are disruptions that harm workers and local communities. We've seen already, and over the last couple of decades, how international trade shifts can, in fact, alter significantly the working environment for communities that are heavily dependent on manufacturing and industry and the companies associated with that. So in order to ensure that industrial production occurs and that the threat of this shifting of production, or what some people call this carbon leakage, will not act as an impediment to climate policy, it's very important that countries are all working hard to reduce emissions so that there's a level playing field for international trade. So that's why the trade and climate issues are linked from both an environmental and an economic standpoint. But there's also the matter of energy security. We see now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the other developments that where one gets one's energy really matters. To the security of supply is incredibly important these days. And there's a growing movement towards making sure that trade is aligned with countries that are allies, that are sharing values, so that that security of supply can really be counted on. So that's true also for our industrial products, particularly where the industrial products are relevant to creating the new clean energy economies, such as batteries or critical minerals that are used in the production of solar panels or other renewable energy technologies that are essential for our climate transition. making sure that the trade in those goods is not disrupted is going to be absolutely essential for achieving energy security and also achieving climate and environmental goals. Finally, there's the question of national security. The Ukraine situation also highlights the importance of trading with countries who share our values. There's a desire increasingly in many countries around the world in making sure that supply chains are secure and resilient. We also see that as a consequence of the supply disruptions from the global pandemic, that countries are wanting to make sure that their supply chains are embedded as much as possible with countries that they feel are going to provide secure supply chains, and that security of supply will allow them to protect their national security interests. So for all of these reasons, the climate issues and the trade issues are coming together, and we're delighted to be hosting this conversation around that nexus. Our first speaker today is Senator Bill Cassidy. He is the senior senator from the state of Louisiana, which is a major energy producing state in the United States. Senator Cassidy has spoken publicly about his interest in working on these trade, national security, energy security, and climate issues, including most recently on the Senate floor, where he gave remarks outlining why he supports the adoption by the United States of a carbon border adjustment measure, which we'll hear about his proposal in a minute. Senator Cassidy is on the Environment and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate, as well as on the Finance Committee. He is well situated to be influencing not only his conservative colleagues in the US Senate, but policy in Congress more broadly. So we're delighted to have Senator Cassidy join us today. Unfortunately, as a result of a last-minute scheduling conflict, we are not able to have him live. I recorded my interview with him just a few hours ago, and we will be playing that now. That means that unfortunately, we won't be able to collect questions from the audience, but fortunately, we do have a great panel that will be following Senator Cassidy. And then also we will be hearing from the Director General of the European Union's DG Klima. This is Kurt Vandenberghe, who is the second ranking climate official in the European Commission. He will be talking about the European Union's efforts to align trade and climate. And so we look forward to a very substantive discussion over the next hour and a half. Well, welcome, Senator Cassidy. We're delighted to have you in this event on trade, climate, and the G7. You have spoken recently about the importance of aligning national security, energy policy, climate policy all together, and the role that border measures can play in that. Could you speak a little bit about what are border measures and why do you think they're so important?
Yes, so thank you for having me. I consider a border measure something, some people call it a carbon border adjustment mechanism. My team and we call it a foreign pollution fee, a little bit of marketing there. And the concept is that if there's the externality of pollution being released or air emissions being released in one country that adversely affect my country or other countries around the world, then that is an externality, which traditionally you address externalities by taxing them. We build this on the concept that there is a nexus between a country's energy policy, its emissions, the strength of its economy, and its national security. If we take the obvious example of China, then as they have grown in energy use, as they've grown in economic power, they have greatly grown in emissions. And parallel with these three kind of lines tracking along each other is the strength of their military, as well as their attempt to extend their influence worldwide, oftentimes in direct conflict with that of those with Western values. So we feel like this is a non-warlike way in order to address that externality and hopefully bring China into a fold of being a better trading partner worldwide.
Thanks so much. How would it apply to the proposal that you're working on, this foreign pollution fee? How would it apply to vulnerable countries like African nations or India? Would all countries be treated the same under your approach?
No, if there's countries that are lower middle income or less, they'll be given a free pass, if you will, for that which is their status quo. As they go forward, they'll be expected to invest in things which have pollution controls or some sort of way to mitigate the emissions. But we do have a pathway for lower income countries to enter into the community of nations which have already developed these mechanisms, these pollution control mechanisms, and to join as trading partners.
And how do you see your approach meshing with the carbon border adjustment mechanism that the European Union has recently adopted and is currently phasing in? Do you think the two would be compatible? And more generally, how would the United States work with its closest allies on carbon border measures?
You can argue that this is only effective if there is a so-called carbon club or climate club in which like-minded nations band together. Now, there's obviously some rubs here. The EU has lowered their emissions using a cap and trade mechanism. The United States has done so with regulations. But there is a cost of compliance to the regulations. Objectively, if you look at emissions in the United States, our emissions now are lower than they were in absolute amounts than they were in 2005. And so the United States has made great strides despite being a more energy intensive economy, more energy, oil and gas production, and more carbon intensive industry. So we've actually had an absolute decline. So I do think there's some compatibility there. There'd have to be some recognition that the cost of compliance to regulation is somewhat equivalent to a cap and trade mechanism. Within that, if you look within the Carbon Club, there would be okay, you can trade with us and we will trade with you without any sort of fee being attached to it, as long as it was reasonable that the carbon intensity of the different products were the same.
When energy, climate, and environmental ministers met in the G7 in Japan last month, they agreed that the G7 countries should work on these issues together. One of the interesting things about that statement is they highlighted the importance of emissions intensity. And if I've understood correctly, your proposal would look a lot at the emissions intensity of products or goods that are in international trade. Is that correct? And why do you think emissions intensity is the right metric rather than whether a country has a particular policy like a carbon tax?
Yeah, because we want people to get to the same place no matter the pathway by which they get there. And emission intensity for a line of emission intensive products is the way to focus your efforts on that which will make the greatest difference as soon as possible. So I think that's the correct strategy to take. But it also allows a country like China, and we would want China to adopt these standards. It's clear under status quo, they would pay a carbon adjustment fee or a foreign pollution fee. But if they begin to do things such as swap out the use of coal for natural gas, renewables, or nuclear, they would dramatically decrease their emission profile and the intensity of their emissions per the product that they were shipping overseas. So we want to give the different countries whatever is the most effective mechanism by which they lower their emissions. To put it differently, it is not a particular way that you lower emissions, it's just that you lower emissions.
Yeah. Do you see this as part of a larger geopolitical alignment that's going on now? There's a lot of discussion in Washington about the lessons from the pandemic and the importance of building more resilient supply chains. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has highlighted the importance of creating a trading system that is resilient to bad actors and to aggression. Do you see the bill that you're working on as fitting within that larger trend or context?
I do, absolutely. And there's other things we're working on, by the way. But one thing that this does is that there's a real kind of quandary. How does the set of countries with Western values, that would include Japan, Australia, New Zealand, who are not in the West, address the threat that China poses? and China seems to exploit every rule that it can in order to gain advantage in international trade and other mechanisms. So in this way, there would be this climate club in which if China wished to import into this club, they would have to meet certain objective standards. Now that is, if you will, a way to diffuse the situation. It isn't saying we're going to stick you with a tariff unilaterally and come on, let's go to war about it. I mean, not literally, but kind of trade-wise. It's like, okay, we just have these standards and we can objectively say there's an externality here. Now, by the way, I have no doubt that China would find a way to retaliate. But the point is that would encourage companies, if China chose to stay outside that system, to nearshore, reshore to countries in which they could participate in this very wealthy market. I just feel like it's a way to pursue a rivalry with China, but to pursue it peacefully in a way that over time mitigates that rivalry.
Thank you. You must be talking to some of your colleagues about these ideas. Do you feel they will be broadly supported among conservatives?
There's a lot of interest. Folks recognize that we have an issue with China, for example, and that this is a way to mitigate that without going to a hot war. No one wants a hot war with China. But it also begins to push back on some of the economic measures that China has done that frankly have had the effect of incenting jobs to leave the United States or the EU and go to China, almost a form of economic warfare, if you will, certainly a warfare for jobs. This, by leveling the playing field, makes a decision as to where to locate those jobs, locate that manufacturing plant, probably a little bit more likely to be in the United States or the EU or Mexico or Canada than it would be to put it in China. Frankly, that's kind of what we should be doing for our workers. On the right, there is the national security aspect, but there's also the economic security aspect. How do we rebuild a working, an economy for working families? So there's a lot of things to appeal to those on the right.
And some of your Democratic colleagues have also put forward, for climate change or environmental reasons, border carbon bills in the past. Do you see the possibility of creating a bipartisan solution down the road?
I do. Again, if you think about the nexus which I described at the outset, national security, the economy of a country and the economy of a family, energy use, and emission profile. You can look across the political spectrum and see something that somebody would be interested in. And they're all part and parcel. It isn't like you can pull one out and get the other three. No, they're all together. So if you care about national security, or if you care about carbon emissions, this is all putting it in a package in which you can support one aspect of the package, but by doing so, you end up supporting all elements of the package.
And are you hearing from companies, particularly in the industrial sector, which is trade exposed and energy intensive, and therefore particularly vulnerable to the offshoring of production as a result of climate policy? Do you envision there'll be widespread corporate support in the United States?
You know, there's been a lot of receptiveness. Has somebody officially come out yet? I can't say that. Has somebody said, hey, we like this and we might be able to get there? Yes, we have heard that. And so we're in the process of socializing, of taking feedback, of modifying the proposal. You always have to balance different stakeholder interests. You know, if you're going to pass something, of course, you always have to do that. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we will get broad industrial support.
And is the data there, or is this part of the project to make sure that the United States government and other governments build out the systems necessary to be able to report on the emissions intensity of goods that are traded? Is that something we can do now, or is that something that would be mandated and therefore maybe would require some sort of phase-in time to be able to build the capacity to do that measurement?
We have some of it, and we need to build out some more. We know national averages for the production of steel. I spoke to the CEO of a super major oil and gas company. He said, there's only so many configurations of a refinery. You show me the configuration, I can show you I can tell you what their emission profile is. But would there need to be, if we're going to take, let's just take gasoline. If we're going to take all the way from the wellhead to the putting of that gallon of gas into a tank of car and the use thereof. We've got a lot of that, but there's some of that which needs to be filled in. And we would like to take that sort of understanding. And so yes and no.
Mm-hmm. And the President Biden is joining G7 leaders later this month at the G7 summit in Japan. Last year, the G7 agreed to create a climate club. The specific provisions of which, or the features for that, were not yet announced. Is this something that you expect or hope will be, particularly the idea of some kind of G7 collaboration or coordination on border measures? Is that something that you would support as an outcome of the G7 summit?
Yes, I don't want it to punish those in the United States who are good actors. So of course, you want to inspect the proposal, but we very much favor a climate club. That's where you get the strength. And that's where you get a market, which is not only large, but also very wealthy, that would attract smaller countries to move towards the standards set by nations with Western values. And that's just kind of the pull of it. So absolutely, I'd support a carbon club with those caveats.
You mentioned that the EU has a different standard. They're looking at whether you have a carbon tax or some other kind of carbon pricing. If they were to give credit for goods that are produced in clean or efficient manners, low carbon intensity, would you envision that approach harmonizing well with your bill? In other words, do you expect that your proposal will help resolve any differences that the United States appears to have with the European Union right now, because they have a carbon border measure adjustment and we do not?
I sure hope so. Empirically, you can look at the carbon profile of, it's off the top of my head, but I think it's steel. And if you look at the emission profile of that which is produced in the United States and EU, they're both, they're equivalent. I would also like to point out that Mexico is pretty close to them. Like if we're 1, they're 1.2. That tells you a couple things. One, that different countries have taken different pathways, but they've landed at the same place when it comes to a very carbon intensive product. But two, because of the trade deal that the US has with Mexico, we've been able to export our environmental standards. So first, it supports a carbon club. And second, it supports allowing countries which are relatively lower income into the club, because we see that our environmental standards will modify theirs for the positive. All that's good.
And would your bill apply to all goods in trade or only certain sectors? How are you?
We picked certain sectors, one for practical reasons, but two, for practical reasons, but two, we would pick the most carbon intensive. And three, I'm a physician, and there's an old axiom in medicine, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you attempt to go to scale right off the bat, you probably will never get there. On the other hand, if you introduce the concept and people become used to it, and then gradually it kind of continues to extend, you're a lot further along. You're just a lot further along sooner than you might imagine.
Fantastic. And could you speak a little bit to timing? I don't know if you formally introduced your bill, but do you plan on doing that if you haven't already later this year or this summer? What is the current thinking on timing?
Yeah, we do hope to introduce it in a few months, within a few months, I'll put it that way. But again, we're socializing, we're balancing stakeholders, we're trying to get other people on board. And so it isn't the pressing of a timeline as much as it is, when we introduce it, will it have enough people understanding it that they can explain it to others? And I think that is more likely to give us long-term success than an earlier introduction.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to say about the bill, or any points that we haven't covered?
I think as just an overall, we need creativity in how those countries with Western values approach China and approach all the other nations that are trying to figure out what system to follow. If you're Vietnam, right now you're competing on the lowest possible price in order to beat a Chinese good of the same category, and by beating them on price in order to gain market share within the United States, the EU, et cetera. We need to flip that, where Vietnam is not making the decision to debase their environmental standards because by so doing they lower their price, they better compete with China. We need to flip this so that Vietnam would decide, no, if we upgrade our environmental standards, we don't have to pay this carbon border fee or this foreign pollution fee. And so therefore, that's how we better compete with China. And of course, China will, be very innovative people, will begin to follow that. Right now, the absence of environmental standards is determining what's happening. With this climate club, we can flip that, and Western value nations standards will begin to establish that. And that's the critical thing to remember.
Super. Thank you so much, Senator Cassidy, for joining us today. Wish you good luck with your bill.
Thank you, Nigel.
Well, we thank Senator Cassidy for joining us earlier, and it was interesting to hear his plans and his ideas for a U.S. carbon border adjustment mechanism. I would highlight that he is not the only conservative senator who is talking about the importance of the United States adopting some kind of foreign pollution fee. There are others, and there may very well be a couple or even three different proposals from the Republican caucus in the Senate over the next number of months. We already have had on the Democratic side a number of different proposals, including from Senator Coons and Senator Whitehouse, that have put forward a different version of the, if I could summarize, I would say that the Democratic proposals begin from the premise that the United States needs to do even more on climate change, and that in the context of doing so, a carbon border adjustment mechanism would be appropriate. Whereas from what we just heard from Senator Cassidy, the perspective there on the conservative side is that with everything the United States is doing now, that already provides the basis for adopting a carbon border adjustment mechanism. That the actions, of course, that he highlighted were U.S. regulations. We heard from the Biden administration just over the last month about important new standards that are being put in place for decarbonizing the transportation sector, as well as the energy and utility sector, the power sector. So the U.S. regulations are getting stronger, even though the United States Congress has not adopted either an emissions trading system at the federal level or a national carbon tax. So that's a difference, I think, between the conservative and the liberal proposals, or the Democratic and Republican proposals for carbon border measures. But there is nonetheless, I think, there's growing momentum in both political parties around the idea that carbon border measures need to be a part of U.S. policy going forward. So I'd like to pivot now to moving away from just the U.S. perspective and looking more broadly at the policy situation across G7 countries. As I mentioned, these issues have been discussed quite significantly within the G7. The G7 is by no means the only political forum or international process that is looking at these issues. And we, in focusing on the G7 today, don't in any way intend to dismiss or undermine the important efforts that are taking place in the World Trade Organization or in global climate negotiations. But the G7 is a group of countries that are relatively like-minded, and so they have proven in the past that they are able to coordinate policy, and that sometimes can have a snowball effect in terms of building momentum and making broader international agreement possible. And it's in that spirit, the idea of the G7 as being a catalyst towards a broader global system, that Climate Advisors partnered with roughly a dozen think tanks from across the G7 countries to create the Consortium for Climate-Aligned Trade. The core idea of the consortium is that these are all think tanks that have worked on trade policy and climate policy simultaneously and are interested in making sure that those different policy areas are aligned as much as possible. And so the idea was to promote collaboration across these think tanks so that different national perspectives can be heard. There are no doubt some countries in this consortium who would have strong objections to the approach that Senator Cassidy has put forward. And so the CCAT is in no way endorsing or opposing that, but rather trying with the meeting today to just promote additional public dialogue on the importance idea of climate and trade. So I am delighted now to turn to my colleague, Matthew Piotrowski, who has been project leader on the Consortium for Climate Aligned Trade and who heads up Climate Advisors trade and industry practice. He will be introducing our expert panel from our CCAT think tank partners and leading a discussion around the ideas and recommendations that have come out of the CCAT process so far. Matt, over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Nigel. And thanks everybody for your time today. We appreciate everyone joining us. I'm Matt Piotrowski, Senior Director of Policy and Research at Climate Advisors. We're very excited for our panel discussion. We'll be taking questions from the audience and hope to get to them at the end of our panel discussion. So if you do have any questions, please add them to the Zoom Q&A function. And now I'd like to quickly introduce our expert panel. Matt Porterfield is the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Climate Leadership Council. Joseph Dellatte is the Research Fellow for Climate, Energy, Environment at the Institut Montaigne in France. Ray Kopp is a Senior Fellow and Director at Resources for the Future. And Johanna Lehne is the Program Lead for the Industry Transition and Trade Program at E3G. Thanks to our panel for their participation today, and we'll jump into our questions now. So we'll get our reactions to the Senator's comments in a bit, but I'd like to start with some broader questions. CCAT's work so far has centered on influencing the G7, as Nigel just spoke about. So in order to increase climate ambition, why is it important for the G7 to focus on climate aligned trade? And I'd like to throw that out to everybody in the panel to get started. Joseph, you want to jump in?
Well, hello. Thank you for having me. I think we need a platform to pioneer climate aligned trade policy, and that's a big issue because there is none at the moment. So G7 countries are the ones that are adopting fast decarbonization policies, or at least some of them, and they need these measures to fight carbon leakage, as Nigel have explained. We need climate aligned trade policy if we want to avoid just basically delocation of energy intensive industries and exportation of our emissions. And I would just maybe finish my first address to say that we need to aim for a common approach between countries that are actually purchasing these goods, these energy intensive goods, well before 2030 if we want to reach carbon neutrality by 2050.
And Matt, just let me add that I think we have been struggling with international competitiveness certainly since the Kyoto Protocol. There's really nothing new about this particular problem. If you wind back then another 12 years or more so, when the U.S. was considering a cap and trade program, competitiveness was addressed within that program. We were using something called output-based rebating for the cap and trade program, but the president had the authority to institute a border mechanism if the mechanisms that were already in place didn't do the job. So this is not anything new. Everyone, I think, knew that internationally traded competitive products were going to be at risk as they decarbonized. And now we're seeing this come full throat here with the European CBAM, which really turned it into a reality. And the US now is kind of following suit. So nothing new here, but we are now in a bit of a different world, even though you could have predicted this coming 15 years ago.
Great, thanks, Ray. Matt or Joanna, would you like to jump in?
Go ahead, Johanna.
Great, thanks. No, just to add to the comments from Joseph and Ray, I mean, I think the EU CBAM definitely kickstarted a conversation around climate and trade, and it definitely heralds this shift in terms of thinking about how we decarbonize the whole of our economies, including those sectors that previously were challenging to touch when we thought about heavy industry and then being trade exposed. But the other dimension I'd like to add here is, of course, in the context of the US Inflation Reduction Act, that we're having a very different conversation about investment in our economies around this, and what that has kickstarted at a global scale is in some ways more profound than the EU CBAM discussion. You're really seeing other countries respond and thinking about what they can do in terms of their own investments on the one hand, is a really positive impetus for clean investment in these spaces. On the other hand, there is a risk here that if it's poorly handled, you actually weaken global incentives to decarbonize and you lose the chance for cooperation in this space. So in that sense, a G7 discussion about climate aligned trade, around how you match up these different measures, how carbon border measures speak to, and a broader industrial policy and green subsidies discussion is really critical in terms of ensuring that we actually maintain that space for cooperation on climate and don't just let it devolve into a situation of competition.
And I just add briefly, if so, you see these disputes growing out of both subsidy policies like the IRA and out of border measures like the CBAM. That's basically the universe of approaches that can be taken to addressing the problem of leakage, and they are both contentious points in trade relations, and they are both covered under trade rules. So in order to address the specific problem of leakage in response to climate policies and the broader challenge of the carbon loophole, which is the approximately 25% of global emissions that are associated with internationally traded products, it's inevitable that there's going to be some tensions between climate policy and trade policy. It can't be avoided, so if it can't be avoided, it should be engaged in a constructive manner, and I think the G7 could be a good forum for that.
Great, thanks, Matt. And thanks for all those great comments. So the next question, first I'd like to go to Johanna and then open it up to the others. This is a similar question to what was asked to the senator earlier. So we saw the G7 climate, energy, environment and energy ministers include some of the CCAT recommendations in their statement a couple weeks ago. For instance, they recognized that carbon intensity is an important factor to address the risk of carbon leakage, and they committed to work together on data and technical issues. Could you talk about the significance of these statements from the G7?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It was definitely very positive to see that language. It builds on previous G7s where we started to see language on climate and trade emerge, for example, the UK G7 ahead of COP26. But this definitely takes it a bit further, and we see it hitting a lot of the right notes, as you note, on sort of talking about emissions intensity as a factor, thinking about how they can work together on data and technical issues. It is worth noting, as I'm sure we will throughout this discussion, that there are lots of different venues in which that conversation on data and technical issues and embodied carbon is happening. So it's a question of alignment and whether G7 can take what the good work that is happening elsewhere and move further on it. To the point on significance, there's a couple of points here. I think a lot of us have seen in the past positive language in a communique that doesn't necessarily go anywhere. So for me, an initial kind of short-term test will really be to what extent the Leaders Summit picks up on some of this language and maybe solidifies it. And then the next key question is really how the next presidency, Italy, basically, of the G7, how they take this. Do they pick up the ball on climate and trade, and do they run with it and ensure that there's concrete action? The reason I raise this is that when we look at the industry decarbonisation agenda within the G7, so not just looking at trade, but specifically those sectors, we saw a very strong push on this from the UK presidency. It was strengthened under the German presidency of the G7. But when it came to the Japanese presidency this year, we haven't seen as much progress as we would have liked. So it's really a question of how significant this is how much that it is run with, how much it's taken forward by the next presidency. And the final point I'd like to make on this is thinking about who is in the room to have these discussions. So when we talk about a climate, environment, and energy ministerial, we have ministers who are used to talking about climate, who are finally talking about trade in this context, which is critical, as we all noted to the former question. But we don't necessarily have the trade and industry ministers who are used to talking about these issues around in the WTO context. So how do we ensure that we are bringing those ministers into the discussion, that the conversation in the climate context is filtering back into a WTO context? Do we need a parallel track where we also bring trade and industry ministers to G7 to talk about this, for example?
Great, thanks a lot for that. I want to come back to the different venues besides the G7 later in our conversation. But for now, I want to ask also about the importance of the G7 focusing on emissions intensity as one of the most important factors, how that gives flexibilities to different countries to implement different types of policies to address carbon leakage.
You looking to anyone to answer that?
Yeah,
Matt,
do Ray or Joseph want to touch on that?
Joseph, you want to go?
Well, the entire question of emission intensity is how do you actually compare the different kinds of measures that are implemented? Measuring emission intensity of a good is not that easy. You need to have common ground on how to really calculate the emissions that are emitted for instance, steel. Are we speaking about downstream emission? Are we speaking about upstream? So there is definitely agreements that are needed to be reached between exporters and importers of these goods. So that's the deal. When we speak about intensity, there is still policy that needs to be implemented in the different parties. So it's indeed a very important aspect, but there is an elephant in the room here. Of course, if two countries export goods to each other and one has a high carbon price and the other one just intensity measures, it raises the question of how do you compare. So there is this to me is a critical issue, and the G7 of course is not going to be the only forum to answer this question, but it should be at least a political dialogue at the highest level where these issues are addressed and where these issues are discussed.
Let me just underscore what Joseph said of two particular items. First, it is going to be a bit of a challenge to not a challenge beyond our capability, but it is going to be a challenge to get unified and consistent and harmonized definitions of greenhouse gas intensity for a variety of projects. We can't have Washington have one intensity measure and Brussels have another. So we have to kind of come together and define how we're going to measure that greenhouse gas intensity. As Joseph pointed out, you've got scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. There can be a variety of different ways. The second point is also a good one. It's something that we've struggled with in our own research. If two countries share the exact same greenhouse gas intensity, say for electric arc steel, does that mean that they are on the same level playing field? And the answer is probably not necessarily. If someone drove the emissions to that intensity through a cap and trade program that layers a lot of cost onto the product price, and someone else, perhaps the US, is using a subsidy program to get to that same program, which does not raise the price of steel, then perhaps you're not on the same playing field. So how you compare these things that matter to countries, that is the international competitiveness based on simply on the price of a commodity that is uniform across countries and traded internationally, is somewhat difficult. That said, going to an intensity measure or a performance standard, let's call it that way, rather than having to adopt a specific policy approach, whether it's a cap and trade program or a regulatory program or what have you, allows more countries to join this carbon club that the senator talked about. Because a lot of countries are going to be using different regulatory mechanisms that are consistent with their own politics, sociology and economics.
So it provides a lot more flexibility for countries going forward.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thanks, Ray. So I want to stay with you, Ray, and also bring Matt into this. I want to turn to the obstacles of aligning trade policy with climate goals, which we've already touched on. One of CCAT's recommendations to the G7 is that the group reduce tensions as much as possible when it comes to aligning trade policy with climate goals. Like, for example, we've seen pushback in the EU to the Inflation Reduction Act, and we've seen pushback in the US to the EU CBAM. What's causing these tensions and how can they be avoided in the future?
Go ahead, Matt.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. So I think there are concerns on both sides of the Atlantic that climate change will be used as a pretext for implementing protectionist economic policies. And at least on the EU side, that these policies will violate WTO rules. In my view, these issues are somewhat overblown. And I think that there needs to be a realization in both the US and the EU that we do have a strong mutual interest in avoiding trade conflicts over climate measures. And a way to avoid that would be negotiating some sort of a broad peace clause that would preclude bringing trade challenges to each other's climate policies. Now, Are the IRA subsidies and the CBAM motivated in part by economic concerns? Absolutely. Governments generally don't make major policy decisions without considering the economic consequences. I don't think that should surprise anyone. But the CBAM and the IRA subsidies are also good climate policy. The IRA subsidies alone are projected to reduce US emissions by about 10% by 2030. The CBAM's direct reductions are projected to be less, but that's a critical component of maintaining the integrity of the emissions trading system, which has been an extremely important driver of emissions reduction. So I think we should look at these policies in terms of their climate benefit, not the fact that governments are trying to accommodate and to some extent elicit economic motivation in order to get these policies enacted. And just briefly on the WTO issues, all of these new trade and climate policies present novel legal issues that haven't been adjudicated in the WTO before. And they all, including the CBAM, will probably have to be justified under one of the WTO's exception provisions. So again, I think there's a strong shared interest, or there should be in the US and the EU, in trying to promote interpretations of the exceptions that are broadly deferential to climate policies. And those interpretations, that deference could be reflected in a formal peace clause agreement under which the parties would agree not to bring trade complaints or impose retaliatory trade measures based on climate policies. But even absent some sort of a formal peace clause, if the US and the EU simply refrain from allowing concerns over climate policies to escalate into trade conflicts, that would be a step in the right direction, pending agreement upon some sort of more formal arrangement.
Oh,
Great,
thanks,
thank you,
Matt.
Matt. Ray, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I agree with everything Matt has said. I've learned an enormous amount from Matt over the last 18 months here. So he's right on. I think there may be nothing we can do to reduce tensions over the IRA and the CBAM right now. They're kind of baked in. There's been some chance of trying to modify the IRA, and there's been a lot of discussion about CBAM, but these policies are baked in. So the question I always look at is what can we do in the future? And this is now getting to the point where I said we've worried about competitiveness before, but now we are linking certainly policies around decarbonizing the industrial sector to the international trade side of this. And now it gets even more complicated than it was before. And I do think that we're missing as a globe an opportunity here. These are not these policies that are being developed. Take the one that Senator Cassidy is working on. These are not simple. Okay, these start to get very complicated, and therefore the input that's necessary into that decision-making process needs to be about as diverse as you can possibly get. And also targeted in a way that deals with a handful of Senate staff that is cooking the stew here in some sense. And we really haven't got to the point until CCAT was put together. We haven't had a formal mechanism where a lot of think tanks, which have a lot of capacity in this particular space, can be drawn in to deal with these issues kind of outside of the government policy development process. And therefore provide some digested and some insights into the process that wouldn't necessarily come about if you're relying on input from stakeholder groups, lobbyists, and what have you. I do think it's really crucially important for the stakeholder, the NGO community to kind of step up and provide expertise here. But the more mechanisms we can do to set that venue in place where these conversations can take place is, I think, particularly valuable. And I think we're short on that, so that we don't get blindsided by a particular policy that's being developed in Brussels and no one is paying attention to it, or the IRA is being developed in Washington and folks in Brussels are only reading newspaper clips about it. There needs to be a lot more communication.
All those are really great points. Thanks for that, Ray. So I want to stick with talking about the EU CBAM. This is to Joseph. Could you just talk about the significance of the EU CBAM and also discuss specific milestones to watch for in the implementation in the coming years?
Yeah, sure. Well, the EU CBAM is extremely significant for the EU climate policy, the Fit for 55 package, because it comes with the reform of the emission trading schemes in the EU that will cover, that will extend the coverage and, well, gradually remove free allocation in the emission trading scheme of Europe. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism will be implemented in the coming years following this this agenda, and it's a logical step after the extension of the ETS and the end of free allocation. So I mean, it aims at the end to fight carbon leakage. So free allocation were there to avoid carbon leakage as much as possible, which basically means to avoid relocating our emissions abroad, as it was the case at the beginning of the EU ETS. So the EU ETS price will be calculated based on 3 pillars. The first one is the price of carbon in the EU. So as you know, we had a price that reached $100 per ton of CO2 in the EU last year, and we will probably have like a higher price in the future with the reform that we've seen. The second pillar is the carbon price in the exporting country. So whether there is a price or whether there's no price. And the third pillar is the emissions intensity of the traded good itself. So this means that the carbon price already paid in the exporting country will be deduced, and that the intensity of the calculation of the intensity of the good will have to be considered based on standard that will be elaborated by the EU Commission. So the CBAM will cover a wide range of products like cement, electricity, fertilizer, iron and steel, aluminium, hydrogen, and probably more products in the future. In terms of calendar, you have it's between 2024 and 2026 a reporting period for exporters, and from 2027 the CBAM will gradually be being implemented until full implementation in 2034. So I will maybe finish my statement here by saying that one of the critical aspects is how the calculation method will be decided, and how it will actually maybe spread outside of the EU as a way to really calculate the amount of emission that is entailed in the trade, embedded in the traded good. So there is also a last crucial aspect here is the MRV dimension. So the measuring, reporting, and verifiability of the good that are imported into the European market, and that's where, in my opinion, big dialogues between countries is necessary.
Great, thanks, Joseph, for all that background. Johanna, so the UK has launched a consulting period on a CBAM. Could you talk about the latest developments in this area and the possibility of the UK agreeing to a CBAM?
Sure. So basically, the idea of a UK CBAM has been kicking around UK government effectively since the EU talked about initiating its own process around this. The UK copied its domestic carbon pricing system over from the EU emissions trading system after Brexit. And so in technical terms, we can actually imagine a UK CBAM working in very similar lines to what Joseph just outlined, effectively externalizing the UK emissions trading system to importers. In practical terms, this is coming up now because, well, for 2 main reasons. On the one hand, the UK has generally shared a lot of the climate, competitiveness, carbon leakage concerns that the EU has historically. And in the context of the US Inflation Reduction Act, these are again coming up domestically in terms of discussions on how competitive UK industries, UK clean industries are in this context. And the second really key element is, of course, in the context of the EU introducing its CBAM, there's a whole conversation about the degree to which the UK simply needs a CBAM. There's a risk of a trade diversion effect happening here, whereby as the EU imports fewer and fewer high carbon products, there is a risk that these could be diverted into a UK market that doesn't have a CBAM. So, for example, carbon intensive cement that would have previously gone to the EU market ending up in the UK market because the UK doesn't have a CBAM. So that's a very practical reason for kind of thinking about it at the moment. And it's why we can also imagine that the UK might move fairly quickly in introducing this. In terms of the timeline, the consultation is going to end this summer. we're imagining that there probably is going to be a national election in autumn 2024. And so there is a window in which the government could introduce the CBAM fairly quickly. And it's also plausible that they will probably try to match the EU CBAM implementation timeframe. So the UK emissions trading system is due to have certain reforms brought into play in 2026. So you can imagine that it would also sort of see its UK CBAM come into play around the same time that the EU one does. The key thing here is that this shouldn't just be treated as a moment to kind of be reactive to the EU CBAM or reactive to the US IRA. This is really a moment where from UK government, we would also want to see a lot more in terms of domestic ambition on climate and specifically on industry decarbonisation. There also needs to be investment in greener industry, discussions around investment in greener steel, for example, in the UK. There also needs to be discussion around the kind of policies and regulatory measures that are needed here. So not just a measure at the border to protect the UK market, but also something which shifts the conversation in terms of domestic ambition on climate and a critical role that the UK could also play around the diplomacy around a CBAM. So on the EU side of things, there has been a discussion of how you kind of socialize this with trade partners, how you make sure that this is something that isn't hitting emerging markets particularly hard, and how there's a cooperative conversation around that. That will also be key for UK discussions here. And given the UK track record on climate diplomacy around COP26, we think the UK could actually play a really critical role in helping to broaden that conversation about the impacts of the CBAM on trade partners. Maybe a final thing to note here is that, interestingly, in the consultation, there is actually quite a big focus on mandatory product standards as an accompanying factor to the UK CBAM. So the idea that eventually you could move to a system of standards, not just a kind of carbon pricing element, which could be interesting in terms of the UK playing a leadership role around the broader kind of trade standards climate conversation going forward.
Thanks a lot, Johanna. That's super helpful for the audience to understand what's going on in the UK. I'd like to stick to CBAMs and talk about the what Senator Cassidy said earlier. And Ray, I'd like to start with you to get your reaction to what Senator Cassidy said, and also take a question from the audience. Someone in the audience asked, what is the rationale for the US to adopt a CBAM when there is no federal price or carbon or national ETS?
Okay, two pieces of this. I can't certainly speak for the senator and how his bill is being developed, but I don't believe they've fully fleshed out how the CBAM is going to be treated. I think, you know, if you do, whatever international trade modeling we have suggests that if the CBAM is imposed on the products that are already on the list, the US is not going to suffer a great deal under these. And so as a result, this may be, you know, more of an ideological battle than anything else. The US, I think it's safe to say, is not going to adopt a carbon tax anytime soon, nor is it going to put a cap and trade price in place. And so we're going to be going down the path that we're going down now. That said, I think as both these border measures gain speed, the one that might come out of the US Senate in a bipartisan way, and certainly as the CBAM moves forward, some sort of recognition that we need to take care of the joint relationships between not only the G7 and the European Union, but some other like-minded nations, as the senator has pointed out, are really important. And those need to be brought into discussions about how we put these policies together. It goes back to my earlier point. We need to have more discussion about who's being harmed by particular policies that were being put in place, and some uniform way of looking at it. Let me just, you know, kind of stop there. I think that's the point I want to make about Senator Cassidy's bill and how the CBAM is going to bear on any kind of additional policies that come forward in the U.S.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for that, Ray. Matt, do you have any reaction?
Yeah, I just thought maybe I'd try to respond to the question, which was, how could a U.S. border charge be justified in the absence of a domestic carbon price? So I think what's being considered in the Senate right now, as the senator and Ray indicated, is going to be some sort of border charge without a corresponding domestic carbon price. So will it technically be a border adjustment? No. Is that term is typically used in international trade law and international tax policy. A border adjustment is the application to imports and potentially the rebate on exports of a domestic indirect tax, generally meaning a tax on products. By that definition, the CBAM may not be technically a border adjustment either, because the CBAM is attempted to mirror the pricing under the ETS. The ETS probably does not qualify as an indirect tax. It's probably a direct tax because it's a tax on emissions for facilities, not taxes on products. So formalistically, neither approach is going to be a border adjustment. Are they justifiable under international trade law? Sure. As I indicated earlier, they probably both would need to be justified under one of the WTO's exceptions, which include environmental exceptions. As such, there are standards that they would have to satisfy, but it is fairly typical for countries to imply some sort of environmental performance standard on imports. So I would view particularly the sort of border charges that are being considered in the U.S. Senate right now as a form of environmental performance standard.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matt. So we're now getting short on time. So I have one last set of questions that I'd like to throw out to the group. We talked about different venues besides the G7 that discuss climate-aligned trade policy. What other forums should we be aware of going forward? What more could the G7 do on climate-aligned trade this year? And also, what can the G7 do to expand its collaboration with countries outside the group, particularly those in developing countries? Anyone want to be first?
I'll say quickly on other fora for discussions. I think smaller and more focused is better. So if you look at negotiations like the global arrangement of sustainable steel and aluminum being negotiated between the US and the EU right now, or these new critical minerals arrangements like the one just signed between the US and the EU, and reportedly also being negotiated between Japan and the US, and also similar negotiations going on between the US and the EU. The bigger the negotiation, the more countries involved, the greater the scope of issues, the greater the diversity of interests, the less chance there is for making progress. So I would start small and focused. And these smaller agreements can be a basis for building out to broader agreement on principles for climate and trade in at least two ways. You could then fold in other like-minded countries into some of these bilateral agreements, which is what's contemplated under the GASA negotiations. You could also just replicate these agreements like the critical minerals deals in a series of separate negotiations. So keep it small and focused enough to make it actually politically plausible that it's going to happen.
I would just
Thanks,
add to the focus idea that Matt brought up. In addition to certainly limiting the number of nations involved in this to start with is probably a good idea, but focusing very tightly on things that are not particularly politically difficult or large political hurdles. Going back to the one that Joseph already mentioned, and this has to do with the definition of greenhouse gas intensity. This seems like, a non-trivial task. It's not. It needs to be harmonized across your trading partners. This is something that could be done inside governments. It could be done outside of governments. It's something that needs to be done. And it's something that I think starts bringing different points of view together, and then can be expanded from that. But a narrow focus on things that are doable and are not subject to clearing large political hurdles, and then something that can be done with a small number of leadership nations seems to make a great deal of sense to me.
Maybe just to come in on this point, I very much agree with Matt and Ray on how you can actually make progress in this context, and especially having a kind of smaller group of like-minded countries that can break ground. I think there's a challenge though, Matt, to your question earlier, there's a tension here between doing that and how inclusive we can be and what we're saying in terms of emerging and developing countries. when we're thinking about the sectors that we're talking about, steel, aluminium, chemicals, the vast majority of capacity additions are going to be happening in developing and emerging markets. And so if we're talking about global decarbonisation and really moving action in that space, we really have to be thinking about how we ensure that those capacity additions are clean and we're not locking in carbon intensive capacity in those countries. And for that, we need a conversation that is absolutely not happening at the moment around access to technology, access to capital, access to knowledge, know-how, all of these elements, which really are currently missing from this frame. It's not necessarily a G7 conversation either, in that it can't only be seen as a G7 only thing. So it's something we really need to think about in terms of maybe it's a complementary element. Maybe there's a G20 discussion that we're having here, but it's really clearly missing at the moment and something we need to get our heads around.
And maybe just to agree, I really agree with what Johanna has just said. And so the conversation on carbon contents of goods should be done with developing countries for sure, because most of the carbon intensive industrial production of the future is going to be manufacturers in these countries, because that's basically where development is going to happen in the future. So including developing countries in the supply chains of carbon neutral goods is essential to realistically achieve global decarbonization and neutrality by 2050. That's basically something that has to be done. That being said, it doesn't mean that the G7 should not pioneer this discussion by first implementing it between them and then trying to attract other countries, and especially developing one into the process.
Thanks, Joseph. That's a great point to end on. So we're now out of time. Thanks to this great panel. This has been a really good discussion and very timely. Now we'll move on to our second main speaker for today, Kurt Vandenberghe, the Director General of DG Klima. He will be interviewed by my colleague, Claire Langley, the VP of Programs at Climate Advisors. So now I'll hand it over to Claire.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, European Commission Director General Kurt Vandenberghe. Mr. Vandenberghe heads the Director General for Climate Action, as Matt mentioned, DG Klima, and this is the department that leads the European Commission's efforts to fight climate at the EU and at the international level. Mr. Vandenberghe has extensive experience working in the Commission for over 26 years, most notably playing a central role in the implementation of the European Green Deal as Green Deal advisor in President von der Leyen's cabinet. Mr. Vandenberghe has held numerous positions at the Commission, including leading DG Research and Innovation from 2013, serving as the head of cabinet for Commissioner for the Environment, Janez Potočnik, and as a member of the cabinet of the Commission of Research and Belgian Minister Philippe Basquin. So welcome, Director General, and thank you for joining us to share your thoughts on how the EU is handling the converging issues around trade and climate.
Very happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
All right, so I'd like to start by getting into a couple of questions for discussion. And if there are questions from the audience, please feel free to post them in the Q&A chat as we're speaking. So starting with your reflections on the United States approach, what do you think of the fact that several US senators are proposing carbon border adjustment measures through new legislation in Congress? Is this something that the EU would welcome?
I think so. We would welcome the sense of movement that there is on the US side, and certainly the interest for climate measures of all kinds. Obviously, I cannot judge or assess what kind of initiatives are currently under preparation. We haven't seen any texts, and the details matter a lot, as you probably know better than I do. But we are very eager to engage in discussions with the US, with our US partners. We consider the US a strong partner in climate action. And so we really want to take every opportunity there is to have this discussion. We find it natural and logical that as a country is increasing its climate ambition, that you're starting to look at all kinds of carbon border measures or mechanisms. That is very consistent with an increased climate ambition. That's definitely how it played out in Europe. So we find it very logical that the US is doing this. And we would hope that the US is very open to engage in these discussions with us from the start.
Thank you. Earlier, we heard Senator Cassidy speak about carbon border measures as important to U.S. national security, energy security, and climate security. How does the EU think about climate and trade in relation to these other priorities?
Yeah, well, for us, as you probably know, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is not a trade instrument. It is not an instrument for competitiveness or for energy security. It is purely an environmental policy measure. It, of course, has an effect on trade, but that's not the prime aim of the whole measure. What we're trying to do is to make sure that as we increase our climate ambition, we avoid carbon leakage. In the past, we have done this through free allocation of allowances. That has meant that there was little, if none, carbon leakage at all. But what we've also seen is that the sectors, the industrial sectors receiving free allocation, were not investing as much as they would otherwise have done in decarbonization. So as we want to increase our climate ambition, we want to look at how we can phase out this free allocation of ETS allowances, but replace it with a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So for us, it's not an energy security or national security policy. It is purely a climate and environmental policy tool. Having said this, indirectly, of course, what we have experienced in the very recent past with the terrible Ukraine war and the unjustified invasion of Russia and Ukraine and the consequences on energy, what we have seen is that climate policy and energy security increasingly go hand in hand and mutually reinforce each other. So it does help over time our energy security, but that's not the prime aim of the CBAM or of our carbon policy overall.
Thank you. Turning now to the G7 process, what can we expect from leaders at the G7 summit later this month to further align trade policy to support climate ambition?
Well, if we can base ourselves on the Sapporo communique, which was adopted by energy, environment, and climate ministers just recently in Japan, that's a very good basis for further work. I think that mentions of the phase out of unabated fossil fuel, for example, avoiding the construction of new coal-fired power plants is very welcome. And we note with great interest and enthusiasm that the US has signed up to this. We also see that in Sapporo, the ministers, the G7 ministers, agreed to go for new global collective targets on renewable energy and energy efficiency, which again is very welcome and is progress in the global climate and energy transition space. We believe that the G7 leaders should reinforce these messages and definitely work together and provide the basis for working together on trade policy that really is consistent with an ambitious climate and clean energy transition policy. We believe we can do this. And for example, earlier on the German presidency, there were terms of reference adopted for a climate club. That is exactly the kind of forum that we need to move on with a special attention to decarbonization of energy-intensive industries.
Thank you. And just to pick up on that last point and to reference one of the questions that came up in the last panel on the multilateral process. On the one hand, the EU has a long history of promoting multilateralism and is a proven leader on climate change ambition and enshrining this ambition into law. On the other hand, harmonizing trade and climate has not been something multilateral organizations, including the UNFCCC and the WTO, has been able to do. In the case of the WTO, global negotiations on environmental goods and services has been stuck for decades. Given this, what does the EU think is the path forward diplomatically with nations beyond the G7?
Well, as you know, the measures that we propose, notably the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is WTO compatible. And we want to keep it this way and will keep it this way because, as you say, we stand for multilateralism and we will always do that. There are many other fora now that are also looking at how to advance on the discussions on climate and climate policy and its impact on trade. By the way, I really would like to welcome the activity of the CICAT in this domain. We need this kind of debate and dialogue to advance on our agenda. But I think there are many fora now that are discussing this, and we from the EU side are gearing up to participate in all of them. There is the Climate Club, as I mentioned. There is also the Inclusive Forum for Climate Mitigation Approaches. International organizations are starting to discuss carbon policies, climate policies overall, and their impact on trade. So we need to foster this dialogue and make sure that there is consistency between all these activities. One last point I would like to say is in connection to the UNFCCC and the Kopp process. As you know, in Sharm el-Sheikh, the outcome also had a strong reference to clean energy transition and renewable energy. And this provides a basis for forming partnerships between the industrialized world and the global south. So if we like it or not, trade will have to be discussed because that is part of the global momentum and movement that we need towards climate action, where climate action is and prosperity enhancing. That's very important for our work with the global south, and not some kind of restrictive policy that keeps down the development of countries in the global south.
Thank you. I want to also just pause and invite some questions from the audience. If there are any for the Director General, please send them through the chat. I have one final question before we get to any audience questions. With respect to the US IRA, it's received a lot of praise for its funding the green transition in the US, but also a lot of criticism from EU leaders as it's seen as hurting the competitiveness of European companies that want to do business in the US. How is the EU responding to the IRA, and do you expect the EU to move forward with similar measures?
First of all, let me say that we welcome the US return into the Paris Agreement and the ambition it is showing through the IRA. We welcome this very strongly. This is very good for climate action globally. There are very important co-benefits to be reaped from the EU and the US working together. All in all, if we combine our efforts, what we see is that we jointly mobilize more than 1 trillion euros in the clean energy transition and in climate action overall. So this is a big force for the good, I would say. There are, of course, some discriminatory elements in the IRA, which the EU regrets, but we are discussing this with the US authorities. We have found arrangements for the tax credits for clean electric vehicles, those that are leased, for example. We will now be working towards some kind of targeted agreement on critical raw materials, which would also mean that EU-based companies could qualify for tax credits under the IRA. We are discussing this in an EU-US dedicated task force. And as you know, Presidents von der Leyen and Biden have decided to set up a clean energy intensive dialogue as part of the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. So there are many things that are being discussed now. In the EU, we now have an agreement on the CBAM. So this is adopted formally by the co-legislators, European Parliament and the member states. We now move to the implementation stage, which will still require a lot of work. And we are calling on our US partners and friends to work together in the implementation both of our policy here in Europe and the IRA in the US, so that we align and harmonize standards and regulations as much as possible so that they are mutually supportive. At the same time, I think it's also fair to say that the IRA has been a wake-up call for the European Union to make sure that we get our act together on the industrial strategy side. And that's exactly what we've done with the Green Deal industrial plan and new proposals that are on the table since a couple of weeks, notably the Net Zero Industry Act, where we are also moving in seeing how we can support our industry, especially the clean tech industry. Because the worst that could be happen for the EU is that we create a massive market for clean tech and green goods in the future, as we're doing with our regulation, but that the goods and the technologies are all supplied from outside of Europe. If that would happen, we would not be able to sustain our climate ambition. We also need to make sure that there is a market supplied from within Europe. But the first best solution is that we do this in a transatlantic common market and preferably even in a global market that is multilaterally organized.
Thank you. And I'll turn to a couple of questions from the audience. And if there are others, we've got a few minutes left, so please feel free to post them. How do you see the US-EU steel deal and CBAM interacting?
Yeah, that is where the discussions are now concentrating most. Stakeholders on both sides of the Atlantic want an agreement on this. Presidents von der Leyen and Biden have announced when they last met in Washington, D.C., that we would work towards an agreement in October this year. That's exactly what we're doing. What is important for the EU is that we find a permanent solution to the Section 232 measures so that we return back to normal, undistorted transatlantic trade, but in a way that we also drive innovation very strongly towards decarbonization of mutual benefit, and that at the same time we address the challenges that are posed by non-market excess capacity, which is especially high in the minds of our US partners. But what the EU will do all the time is make sure that whatever outcome is there will be in compliance with WTO and in compliance with our EU domestic policy that we have now agreed. So these are the parameters in which we work, and we are working very, very hard to make sure that there is an agreement possible by October.
You mentioned earlier trade agreements on critical minerals. In terms of your partnerships with the Global South, I just wanted to follow up on that. How do those agreements interact with trade and things like climate finance reform?
Yeah, we are working now with the US and other countries that would join such a critical raw materials club or alliance, looking also at how to strengthen and secure supply chains. But that does not prevent us from also looking at partnerships with the Global South. For example, we are working very hard on our partnership with Namibia on sourcing renewable hydrogen, critical raw materials, and maybe other goods on the industrial value chain. One does not exclude the other. But obviously, again, a first best solution that we do this would be that we do this as much as possible in a multilateral framework. And WTO is definitely a forum that from the EU side, we want to see strengthened and reformed. You may know that the EU has recently launched an initiative with 27 ministers on climate. Not just 27 EU ministers, but ministers of trade that are active and interested in climate policy from across the world. So we also want to see in the international organizations like WTO, how we can best reform and strengthen WTO to make this possible.
Senator Cassidy said earlier that trade policies would help encourage China to increase its climate ambitions. Does the EU believe that trade policies are needed to incentivize action by China?
It will definitely help. Let's always be clear that trade is not the main driver for climate action, but it is definitely a necessary and indispensable enabler. And it's true that if a big market like the EU or the US says increasingly that we want to import clean products and not dirty products, this has an effect on major exporting nations. So we have to really move gradually, very gradually in such direction. At the same time, we also believe that cooperation with China is essential. We are working with China on the emission trading system that already exists in China. We want to work with China to see how we can further enhance and reinforce that measure, which would also be a very important vector for increasing its climate ambition. So it's not only competition and trade policy, it's competition and cooperation. What we also see is that carbon pricing through the emission trading system in the EU is delivering enormous results. We have recently celebrated 2,500 auctions under the ETS. We have reduced emissions by 35% since, more than 35% since 2005. And interestingly, we have generated through the ETS 142 billion euros of revenues, of which 38 billion only last year. These are revenues that we are reinvesting in innovation and in social transition programs. But we could imagine that over time, if a sufficient number of jurisdictions adopt domestic carbon markets that generate revenues, that a certain part of these revenues could go to climate finance to help the least developed countries in the world to be part of this climate action ambition, which should be prosperity enhancing, as I said, rather than restricting development.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Director General, for your thoughtful remarks and for your time today. We're out of time, so I'd now like to close by thanking all of our panelists and our speakers for joining us today. And a special thanks goes to the Climate Leadership Council for helping make this event possible. Thanks to all of you in the audience for tuning in, and we'll be sending around the recording of this event to everybody who's registered, and our full CCAT G7 recommendations are available on the Climate Aligned Trade website. Thank you.